A Japanese officer sits down. The American across the table weighs about 120 pounds. The officer has questioned this man 3 times in 6 weeks. And every time, at the end, the American asks the same thing. He asks when his mail is going out. There is no mail. His name is not on any list anywhere on Earth. The Red Cross does not know he is alive. His mother in Ohio has a telegram that says missing. This camp was built deliberately from the ground up so that no one would ever find him. And the American keeps asking about his letters. The officer does not know what to do with that. Over the next 3 years, dozens of officers like him would sit in rooms like this one, and none of them would know either. The place they are sitting in does not appear on any map drawn during the war. It sits in a valley in Kamakura, southwest of Yokohama, about 30 miles from the center of Tokyo. Before the war, it was an elementary school. Children walked through those gates in the morning. There was a field where they ran. On the 26th of April, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy took that ground and turned it into something else. They built a wooden fence around it, 12 feet high, so that no one passing on the road could see in. They kept the 3 low buildings and the field they enclosed. Inside the buildings, they ran a long central hallway and cut 30 rooms into each side. It was roughly 4 feet by 8. In each room, they put a single electric light, a bunk, a bamboo mat, with a small window. And at each end of the hallway, where a school corridor would have ended in a classroom, they built an interrogation room. The camp was called Ofuna. Its name was never given to the International Red Cross. The men held inside it were never registered as prisoners of war. Their families were not told they were alive. Their names went into no ledger that any neutral power could inspect. The secrecy was so complete that people living in the surrounding neighborhood did not know what the fence was for. If you died at Ofuna, the only people on Earth who would know were the men in the cells beside you. And they were forbidden to speak. That was the rule. No speaking to another prisoner. No hands in your pockets. No eye contact. Rules for how to fold a blanket. Rules for how to ask for water. Rules for when you could use the latrine and how you had to ask. Breaking any of them meant a beating with a wooden club. And when the men who arrived there, American submariners, American pilots, men pulled out of the ocean or out of a burning cockpit, asked the obvious question. The question every soldier is taught to ask. The answer came back flat. They were told they were not prisoners of war. They were told they were unarmed combatants. They were told the protections of international law did not apply to them because they had never been entered into the system that grants those protections. They existed nowhere. That was the point. To the submarine crews, the interrogators put it more directly still. You survived the sinking of a submarine. Nobody survives the sinking of a submarine. Therefore, according to the record, you are already dead. Hold that sentence. Turn it over. Because it is not a threat. It is a philosophy. It is the operating logic of an entire military system compressed into a single line, and everything that follows in this story flows out of it. The Japanese Navy built Ofuna for one storage. Ofuna existed to extract information from human beings. And what happened inside those interrogation rooms over the next 3 years would leave a set of Japanese officers genuinely, permanently confused. Not about the war, about the men across the table. But before we go into that room, you need to understand something. You need to understand what had been done to each of those 2 men, the one asking the questions and the one answering them, long before either of them ever saw the Pacific Ocean. Because they had been built, deliberately, by 2 societies that made opposite bets about what a human being is for. And one of those bets was about to come due. If stories like this one matter to you, the kind that go looking for the record, instead of the legend, a like and a subscription, help them find the people who want them. Let me take you first to a desk in Washington, in the autumn of 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor. Before there was a war for America to be in, the man sitting at that desk was a psychologist named Walter Van Dyke Bingham. He was 59 years old, close to 60. He had a doctorate from the University of Chicago. He had spent his career on a question that most people would consider dull to the point of invisibility. How do you find out what a person is good at? Not how smart they are, what they are good at. There is a difference, and Bingham had spent 30 years living inside it. In 1940, he was made chief psychologist of the Personnel Research Section, sitting under the Adjutant General's Office of the United States Army. And he was handed a problem that no army in human history had ever been handed. The United States Army in 1939 was small. Genuinely small, somewhere around 190,000 men, smaller than the standing army of a mid-sized European country. In a world that already contained the Wehrmacht and the Imperial Japanese Army, the American land force was a rounding error with good intentions. And now it was going to grow, not by a fraction, by orders of magnitude. Millions of men were going to walk through the doors of reception centers over the next 4 years. They would not be soldiers. That is the part that is hard to hold in your mind now, 80 years later. They would be civilians. They would arrive in the clothes they owned. a dairy farmer from Wisconsin, a shipping clerk from Baltimore, a high school teacher from Alabama who had never held a rifle, a 20-year-old from a Pennsylvania coal town who had never been more than 40 miles from the house he was born in. They would come in carrying suitcases, and the Army had roughly 3 days with each of them. 3 days to decide what this specific human being should do in the largest industrial war ever fought. Now here is where most tellings of this story go wrong, and here is the first thing in it that should genuinely surprise you. The obvious solution, the one every army in the world had used for centuries, was to sort men by where they came from. Class, family, background. You take the university men and the sons of the officer class and you make them officers. You take everyone else and you make them a body with a rifle. That is how it had always been done. Not because generals were stupid, but because it was cheap, fast, and matched the social order that already existed. Britain did a version of it. Germany did a version of it. Japan did a severe version of it. The Army General Classification Test did something different. Around 150 questions, about 40 minutes. Vocabulary, arithmetic reasoning, spatial relations, pattern recognition. A man sat at a bench with a pencil in a room full of other men with pencils and worked through it. And here is what almost everyone gets wrong about it. The AGCT was not primarily an officer selection instrument. Scores did matter. For a commission, a man generally needed to test above a certain threshold to be considered for officer candidate school. But that was a side door, not the purpose. It was a universal sorting instrument. It was run on everybody. Not the promising ones, not the college men, everybody who came through the door. Roughly 9 million men took some version of it during the war. The exact figure varies depending on which version of the test and which counting method you use. And anyone who gives you a single confident number is guessing. But the scale is not in dispute. It was millions. By a very wide margin. The largest psychological testing program that had ever been conducted on human beings anywhere. By anyone. For any reason. And its purpose was to answer a question about each individual man. Not, is he good enough? What is he good for? That is not a small distinction. That is a civilizational one. The Army did not want to know who deserved rank. The Army wanted to know who could be taught to calibrate a bomb sight. Who could be taught to keep a radial engine running in salt air? Who could be taught to compute a firing solution under pressure? Who could read a technical manual and then act on it without supervision? Bingham and the psychologists around him were not measuring intelligence for its own sake. They were measuring trainability. How fast can this specific man learn a complicated technical skill? And when the answer came back high, the Army did not necessarily make that man an officer. The Army made him a mechanic, a radar operator, a fire direction computer, one of the men who turned map coordinates into gun elevations in seconds while shells were landing. A man from a farming town with no high school diploma who tested strongly on spatial reasoning could end up rebuilding aircraft engines. A clerk who tested strongly on arithmetic could end up in the fire direction center of an artillery battalion. The test did not know his father's occupation. The test did not know his church. The test did not care, in a way that was almost brutal and almost beautiful at once, about anything except what his mind could be trained to do. And here is the consequence. Here is why this desk in Washington in 1940 matters to a concrete room in Kamakura in 1943. By the time an American enlisted man arrived in the Pacific, he had already been examined, classified, assigned by measured aptitude, and then trained for weeks, often for months in a technical specialty. He was not a body that had been handed a rifle. He was a body that had been handed a rifle and a trade. The private who ends up sitting in a Japanese interrogation room is therefore not the equivalent of a Japanese private. He is something the Japanese system had no category for. The AGCT was not a miracle, and it was not fair. Its scores tracked schooling, and American schooling in 940 was viciously unequal. Black soldiers, tested by the same instrument, served in a segregated army that would not let them into most of the specialties their scores qualified them for. From the rural South, from communities the state had never bothered to educate, scored low and were sorted into labor units, and the Army then used those scores to justify the sorting, in a loop that told itself it was objective. The system was not blind. It was blind only to some things. But even accounting for all of that, even holding all of that in full view, the machine was doing something that no other belligerent in the war was doing at that scale. It was assuming as a starting premise that the mind of an ordinary conscript was an asset worth measuring. That premise is the whole story. Remember it, because the other side of the world had built its army on the exact inverse. Let me take you there now. In a barracks in Japan in the same period, 1,000. 938. 1,000. 939. 1,000. 940 a young conscript arrives. He is 18, 1920. He may be from a rice farming village in the north. He may be from a factory district in Osaka. He is not given a test. His first weeks in the Imperial Japanese Army are not spent discovering what he is good at. They are spent discovering what he can endure. He is struck by his squad leader, by second-year soldiers, by anyone above him, which is everyone. Open hand across the face. A leather slipper, a bamboo stick, a rifle butt. He is struck for serving rice slowly. He is struck for a crease in a folded blanket. He is struck for standing in a way someone did not like. He is struck, frequently, for nothing at all, because the entire line is struck, one man after another, down the row. And the point is not the offense. This had a name, Tekken Seisai, Iron Fist Discipline, and here is the piece most people get backwards. It was not a breakdown of discipline. It was not sadistic, that officially forbade it. It was not, in the main, corruption or excess or an army losing control of itself. It was, in practice, the core of basic training for the Imperial Japanese Army's enlisted ranks. The violence, coherent internal logic, which is what makes it genuinely disturbing rather than merely ugly. Soldier who has been beaten past the point of resistance will obey without pause. And obedience without pause was the single sin wanted most from an enlisted man. Not judgment, not initiative, not understanding, speed of compliance, because the doctrine those men were being built for depended on it. The night assault, the mass charge, the bayonet closing the last 100 meters. All of it required men who would move the instant they were told into fire, without the fractional hesitation that comes from a man thinking about whether the order is a good one. Hesitation was hesitation. So thought was trained out, and there was a text underneath it. There was always a text. Every morning in barracks across the empire, soldiers recited the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. It had been issued in 1882 in the name of the Meiji Emperor. It had been recited every morning for 60 years. Its instruction on the chain of command was not ambiguous. Orders from a superior were to be received as though they issued from the emperor himself. Sit with that. Not as though they came from a competent commander. Not as though they came from a man with more information than you. As though they came from a living order of a god. You do not ask a god for context. You do not, under any circumstances, form a private opinion about whether the god has misread the terrain. An order was not a proposition to be understood. It was a sacred act to be executed, and so information moved in one direction only, downward, in the smallest quantity that would still produce the required movement. A company commander might know the battalion's objective. A platoon leader might know the company's. A private knew the direction to walk and the signal to fix bayonets. He did not know the name of the island he was standing on. That is not a figure of speech. Post-war interrogations and captured documents indicate that Japanese enlisted men were frequently landed on objectives without being told where they were. Some knew only that they had been sent to a place. He did not know what unit was on his flank. He did not know why the attack was happening tonight instead of tomorrow. He did not know what the operation was called or what it was for or what would count as success. His body belonged to the emperor. His mind was not part of the transaction. And in January 941, this whole architecture received its final and most famous instruction. The Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, was issued to the army by the Minister of War. That minister was Tojo Hideki. He was 56 years old, a career army officer, a man of intense administrative energy and narrow vision who would be Prime Minister of Japan by October of that same year. The Senjin-kun covered conduct, morale, obligation, and it contained the passage that would kill more Japanese soldiers than any Allied weapon. It instructed the soldier not to live to suffer the shame of being taken prisoner. That is the line, that is the whole hinge. Now an important correction, because this is where popular history usually overshoots. The Senjin-kun did not invent this. Japanese military culture had been moving in this direction for decades before 1941. And it was a field code, not a law. There were Japanese soldiers who surrendered anyway, and there were more of them as the war went on than the mythology allows. But its effect on the institution was real and it was measurable. It made surrender not a misfortune but an erasure. A man who was captured had, in the eyes of the code, ceased to be. His family might be told he was dead and might prefer it. Some men who survived captivity would find, on returning home in 1945 and 1946, that there was no place left for them in the society they had been fighting for. And that specific fact produced a consequence that almost nobody anticipates. The Imperial Japanese Army had a doctrine that forbade its men from being taken prisoner, which meant it had almost no doctrine for what to do if they were. There was no serious institutional training in resisting interrogation. Why would you train a man to survive a situation he is forbidden to enter? There was no equivalent of a name, rank, and serial number discipline hammered into every recruit. There was no established procedure for a captured Japanese soldier because the official position of the institution was that a captured Japanese soldier did not exist. And on the other side of the ocean, the American soldier was handed the opposite package. He was told the Geneva Convention existed. He was told he had rights as a prisoner. He was told to give his name, his rank, and his serial number, and nothing further. He was told that capture was a hazard of the job, bad luck, not disgrace, and that the war would end and he would go home. 2 documents, 2 instructions, 2 interrogations to a man when he is taken. And there is a bitter detail underneath it that most people never learn. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, signed it and never ratified it, so it was not legally bound. After the war began, under pressure through Swiss diplomatic channels, Tokyo indicated in 1942 that it would apply the convention's provisions with necessary modifications. In practice, that assurance was worth very little. Ofuna is the proof. A camp that was never reported holding men who were never registered is not a lapse in a system attempting compliance. It is a system built specifically outside in the plurum. On one side of the table, an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy or the Kempai Tai, the Army's military police. Often well-educated. In many cases fluent in English, some of them had studied in the United States before the war. Walked American campuses, eaten in American diners, and come home fluent in a language they now used in a concrete room. He belongs to an institution that has spent 70 years teaching that the enlisted man's mind is a liability. He has been formed by a system in which information is rank, and rank is sacred, and the flow of one to the other is the structure of the world. On the other side, an American, 22, 25, 28, injured, probably, terrified, certainly, whatever he shows, and a member of the most systematically tested, sorted, and technically trained enlisted force ever assembled. And here is where the popular version of this story goes wrong. Because the popular version of this history, the version that circulates widely, the version that flatters, says the Japanese officers were stunned by how much American privates knew. That a starving American enlisted man could describe the disposition of an entire regiment while his Japanese counterpart could barely name his own division. That comparison is broadly true as a description of the 2 systems. It matches everything we know about how information moved in each army. But it is not what the surviving record shows those officers actually reacting to. What the post-war testimony and the prisoners' own accounts describe is smaller, stranger, and much harder to sit with. The thing that unsettled Japanese interrogators again and again was not simply that Americans knew a great deal. It was that Americans talked at all, and that they sat there expecting to go home. Both halves come from the same root, and that root is the whole story. 2 societies had placed opposite bets on whether the mind of an ordinary man was worth trusting. The interrogation room is where you can see the gap. Saipan and Iwo Jima are where you can see what it cost. Understand the position of the man asking the questions. Every instinct his institution had given him said this conversation should not be occurring. In the moral universe he had been trained inside, the man across the table had already failed the only test that mattered. He had been captured and had not died. He should be silent, broken, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Instead, the American answers the question, sometimes under a club, sometimes to the interrogator's visible discomfort, casually the way a man answers a question at a bar. And then he asks when his letter home is going out. That is the moment. That is the actual documented collision, and it is far more interesting than the flattering version. Because the American is not being brave in that moment. He is not defying anyone. He is doing something more disorienting than defiance. He is behaving as though he still has a future. He believes the war will end. He believes there is a mechanism, a Red Cross, a convention, a neutral power, a system that will eventually deliver him back to a house in Ohio or Texas or Massachusetts. He believes his name is written down somewhere and that this matters. The man questioning him knows there is no letter, knows the name is written down nowhere, knows that this camp was constructed precisely so that no such mechanism could reach inside it. And he has to sit across from a person who has not yet understood that. Now let me be exact about the limits of what we can say, because I promised you accuracy, and accuracy has edges. We do not have the inner thoughts of those officers. Very few of them wrote memoirs. Interrogation records were destroyed in enormous quantities in August 1945. In the days between the surrender broadcast and the arrival of Allied forces, when Japanese units burned files across the empire. Most of what we know about what happened inside Ofuna comes from 2 sources, and both need handling with care. The first is the testimony of the prisoners themselves, given after liberation, when they were sick and furious, accurate on structure and routine, on the interior life of their captors. The second is the record of the war crimes trials held at Yokohama, where camp staff were prosecuted and where every man testifying had an obvious reason to shape what he said. So when I tell you a Japanese officer was stunned, I am not reading his mind. I am describing a pattern that shows up repeatedly in the accounts of the men who sat across from him, a visible failure of expectation. Interrogators who did not know how to proceed, questions that stalled, sessions that ended early, anger that arrived without a trigger. The interpretation that this was 2 military cultures failing to recognize each other is interpretation. It is well supported. It is not a transcript. You should hold it as a reading of the evidence, not as the evidence itself. What is not interpretation is the machinery. The interrogations at Ofuna ran on a cycle. Roughly every 2 weeks, a prisoner would be brought back to one of the rooms at the end of the hall and asked again. And the interrogators kept notes. And they compared them, not just across sessions, across prisoners. If 2 men had served on the same submarine, their accounts were laid beside each other and searched for the places where they diverged. Understand what that does to a human being. If you tell the truth, you must remember the truth. That is easy. If you lie, you must remember the lie perfectly. For months, at the same level of detail, under starvation, in the dark, in a 4-by-8-foot room where you are forbidden to speak to another living person and therefore cannot check your story against anyone. A man who is not fed loses ability to hold detail. That is not weakness, it is physiology. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th month, the mind exactly the small things, a number, a date, a designation that the notes were built to catch. System was designed to outlast the prisoner's memory, not his courage, his memory. And what were they after with all that machinery? Some of it was the ordinary currency of war, unit designations, aircraft performance, fleet movements, but one question came up so persistently that the prisoners noticed it and remembered it and reported it afterward. The Japanese wanted to know how American submarines could dive so deep. It is a strangely specific thing to want. And it is a window straight into the war. American submarines were dismantling the Japanese merchant fleet. An island empire that imports its ore, its rubber, and much of its food was watching its shipping vanish. Japanese destroyers were setting their depth charges based on assumptions about how deep an enemy boat could go, and American boats were going under that ceiling and living. Somewhere in a metallurgical answer about hull steel and test depth was the survival of the empire's supply line, so they asked. And they asked again. And to sharpen the asking, they told the submariners something calculated to isolate them completely, that they were not soldiers but criminals, because the ships they had sunk carried civilians, and that as criminals they would eat half of what a prisoner eats. That is not an interrogation technique aimed at a man's fear. It is aimed at a man's standing. It is designed to sever the last thread connecting him to the category of person who has rights. And it tells you exactly how the system understood human beings. Rank confers reality. Strip the rank, strip the category, and what remains is a body that will eventually say something useful. Which brings us to the sentence that should be sitting at the front of your mind for the rest of this story. The Imperial Japanese Navy built a camp designed to make men cease to exist in order to extract information from them. And the American system had spent 4 years and an enormous amount of federal money on the opposite proposition that an ordinary man's mind was worth measuring, worth training, and worth trusting. Those two propositions were now going to be tested against each other, not in a debate. On a beach, we are going to go there. We are going to Saipan, in June of 1944, where a Japanese general named Saito Yoshitsugu prepared a defense against an enemy he thought he understood. We are going to the night of the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. When a Japanese wave broke clean through an American line, the line did not collapse, and we will look closely at exactly why it did not. And at the 2 men who died holding it, whose names are in the record and whose citations you can read. We are going to Iwo Jima of 1945, and to a Japanese general who had driven across the United States in the 1920s, and who came home and told his government, in writing, that this was a country Japan must never fight. And we are going to end in Osaka on the 8th of August, 1945, with a 24-year-old fighter pilot in the hands of the Kempeitai, a man who knew nothing at all, and whose lie went straight to the cabinet of Japan. In a valley in Kamakura, behind a 12-foot fence, on the site of an elementary school, 4 feet by 8, with 1 electric light, with a man who has been told he does not exist, asking when his mail goes out. Let me stay in that room a little longer. Because the machinery of Ofuna is the part of this story people skip, and it is the part that explains everything that follows. 2 weeks, that was the interval. A man would be taken from his cell, walk down the corridor, and put back in front of the same questions he had answered 14 days earlier. And the notes from the first session were sitting on the table. Now think about what that does to the arithmetic inside a man's head. He has 3 options and none of them are good. He can tell the truth. The truth is easy to remember. The truth costs him nothing in concentration, and the truth may kill men he served with. He can refuse. Refusal is clean, and it is what he was trained to say he would do. And it is answered with a wooden club across the back and shoulders. And then the question comes again. Or he can lie. At Ofuna was not a single act of courage. A lie was a construction project. He had to build a false world and then live inside it, alone. 4 feet by 8, on a bowl of rice and thin soup, for months, while the men holding the notebooks looked for the seam. And he could not check his work. That is the piece that most people never think through. He could not lean over to the man in the next cell and ask what he had said about the fuel capacity. Speaking to another prisoner was forbidden. Speaking in your sleep was forbidden. So the lie had to be held in one starving mind, unrehearsed, unshared, for as long as the war lasted. The interrogators were not mostly trying to break a man's will. Will is durable, men surprise you. What they were doing was more patient and more cruel than that. They were waiting for his memory to fail, because it will. Take 400 calories a day away from a grown man for 90 days, and his body will start burning muscle, and his mind will start dropping the small things first. Not his mother's face. The small things a number. A date, a depth. Exactly the things the notebooks were built to catch. There is a kind of horror in that which has nothing to do with blood. It is the horror of a system that has correctly identified the weakest point in a human being and then simply waited there. And here is what makes the whole apparatus so strange when you look at it clearly. They were not particularly good at it. Not because the officers were stupid, many of them were not. Some had studied in the United States, some spoke better English than the prisoners did. This was not a failure of individual intelligence, and any version of this story that tells you it was is lying to you. It was a failure built into the shape of the institution itself. Which brings us to the question they kept asking, over and over. In session after session, month after month, they came back to the submarines. How deep can your boats go? Sounds like a technical curiosity. It was not. It was the empire's throat. Japan is an island chain that manufactures almost nothing it needs from the ground. Oil from the Indies, iron ore, rubber, bauxite, rice from the mainland. Every one of those things had to cross water in a ship, and by 1943 American submarines were taking those ships apart at a rate that no shipyard in Japan could replace. The counter to a submarine is a depth charge. And a depth charge is a fuse. Someone sets a number on it, this many feet, and drops it. And if the number is right, the boat dies, and if the number is wrong, the water absorbs the blast and the boat goes home. Japanese destroyers were setting their fuses based on what Japanese engineers believed an enemy submarine could survive. And American boats were going beneath that number and living. So the officers in that hallway in Kamakura were not asking an idle question. They were asking the question that stood between the Japanese merchant fleet and its extinction. Somewhere in an answer about hull steel, about welding, about test depth, was the difference between an empire that could be supplied and one that could not. And here is something most people find hard to believe the first time they hear it. The most dangerous thing a captured American could do in that room, at that table, was tell the truth. Not because the truth would betray his crew, because the truth would get him beaten. Consider what an American enlisted man could honestly say in 1943 and 1944 about his own country's production. He had read the same newspapers everyone else read. He had heard the same radio broadcasts. He had watched, in some cases, a shipyard in his own hometown put a hull in the water in a matter of months. He could tell an interrogator truthfully that new fleet carriers were going into the water one after another. That escort carriers were coming off the ways at a rate no navy in history had approached. And by late 1944, a prisoner could describe the enormous four-engine bomber then appearing over Japan and give its range honestly. And the officer across the table would hear a starving prisoner reciting numbers that could not possibly be real. From inside Japan, in 1943, they were not real. They belonged to no world the man had ever lived in. The Japanese economy in that year was producing at a scale that made those American figures sound like a schoolyard boast. To an officer trained in an institution that taught spiritual force over material force, hearing a prisoner claim his country was building warships faster than the enemy could sink them did not sound like intelligence. It sounded like propaganda. It sounded like a man trying to frighten his captors with a fairy tale. And so the club came out. Now, before I let that image sit with you, you need to know exactly what it is. We do not have a transcript of a specific beating over a specific production figure. What we have is consistent testimony from liberated prisoners that answers the interrogators judged implausible were treated as lies and punished as lies. The scene is a reconstruction from that pattern. Hold it that way. And held that way, it is still the whole war in miniature. A man is beaten for accuracy. The truth arrives, plain and free, offered across a table by a prisoner with no reason left to invent anything, and the system rejects it, because the system has been constructed in such a way that it can no longer recognize a true thing when a true thing is placed in front of it. What is not interpretation is the machinery. The interrogations at Ofuna ran on a cycle. Roughly every 2 weeks, a prisoner would be brought back to one of the rooms at the end of the hall and asked again. And the interrogators kept notes. And they compared them, not just across sessions, across prisoners. If two men had served on the same submarine, their accounts were laid beside each other and searched for the places where they diverged. Understand what that does to a human being. If you tell the truth, you must remember the truth. That is easy. If you lie, you must remember the lie perfectly. For months, at the same level of detail, under starvation, in the dark, in a 4 by 8 foot room where you are forbidden to speak to another living person and therefore cannot check your story against anyone. A man who is not fed loses ability to hold detail. That is not weakness, it is physiology. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th month, the mind exactly the small things, a number, a date, a designation that the notes were built to catch. The system was designed to outlast the prisoner's memory, not his courage, his memory. And we have the underlying reality of Japanese intelligence, which is not in dispute at all. Japan consistently catastrophically underestimated American industrial capacity. That failure is written into every strategic decision the empire made from 1941 onward. There is a name for what an organization is doing when it punishes information that contradicts what it already believes. It is not evil, exactly. It is worse than knows what it is doing. It is an organization that has made itself blind and then punished the people trying to describe the room. There was nothing wrong with Japanese minds, not the officers, not the enlisted men's. The Imperial Japanese Army ran an intelligence school in Tokyo, founded in 1938 and known from 1940 as the Nakano School, which produced some of the most sophisticated operatives of the war. Men trained in languages, in political subversion, in clandestine organization, in propaganda, in the long patient work of running networks in foreign countries. Some of them were extraordinarily effective. Some of them were still operating in the jungles of the Philippines decades after the surrender because they had been trained too well to stop. Japanese officers formidably educated. The Imperial Japanese Navy's engineers had designed the Type 93 torpedo, a weapon so far ahead of anything the United States Navy had that the Americans initially refused to believe the range reports coming out of the Solomons. The Zero fighter, in 1941, outclassed everything the Allies could put in the air against it. This was not a stupid country. In 1941, one of the most technically advanced societies on the planet. So when I tell you the Japanese system failed at the level of the enlisted man, understand precisely what I am and am not saying. I am not saying they lacked intelligence. I am saying they made a choice about where intelligence was permitted to live. They concentrated it in the officer corps, in the technical bureaus, in the staff colleges, in Nakano. And they worked very hard to make sure it did not leak downward into the ranks. The Americans distributed it, also deliberately, through a testing program, a school system, and a habit of telling a sergeant why. Two opposite bets on the mind of an ordinary man. In the interrogation room, that gap only looked strange. In June of 1944, on an island a little over 1,000 miles from Tokyo, it was going to be settled in the open and paid for. Saipan, 6 miles across at the widest, ridge of green running up its spine to a peak called Mount Tapachau, and sugarcane in the lowlands and coral reef offshore. And an airfield. That was the whole reason. From Saipan, a B-29 could reach Tokyo and come back. Take Saipan and the Japanese home islands stop being distant. They become a destination with a schedule. Tokyo understood this. Saipan was not an outpost. It was administered as Japanese territory. There were tens of thousands of Japanese civilians living on that island: farmers, sugar workers, shopkeepers, their wives, their children. Hold that fact. It becomes unbearable later. The commander of the defense, Saito Yoshitsugu, he was 53 years old, a career army officer, a cavalryman by background. He had arrived only weeks before the invasion, inheriting a garrison that was still unloading its equipment and a command arrangement that was tangled between army and navy. Saito was not a fool. He had studied what the Americans did at Tarawa. He knew the pattern. Naval bombardment, then landing craft crossing a reef. Brief, chaotic, absolutely critical when the attackers are ashore and exposed and have not yet sorted themselves out. That window was where he put everything. He pre-registered his artillery on the reef, not aimed at guesses measured. Japanese gunners had ranged the water in advance, and in places had planted markers so that a spotter could call a correction against a known point and put steel exactly where the amphibious tractors would be crawling. It was good work, in fact professional work of a very high order. On the 15th of June, 1944, at around 8:30 in the morning, first waves of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions crossed that reef. And Saito's plan worked. And this is the part the American memory of this battle skips, because it goes straight to the flag and the victory. It should not. The artillery came down exactly where it had been calculated to come down. Amphibious tractors were hit on the water and burned. Mortar fire walked across the sand in measured rows because someone had measured it. Machine guns opened from positions on the high ground that the bombardment had not touched. The landing plan, the timetable, the phase lines, the objectives for day one came apart in the first hour. By the end of that first day, the Americans had put roughly 20,000 men ashore and taken something on the order of 2,000 casualties. They held a beachhead that in most places was a few hundred yards deep. The operation had been planned for a few days. It would take 25, and in the days that followed, the thing that decided the battle was not that the Americans had a better plan. It was that the plan was already dead, and they kept moving anyway. Men whose lieutenants were hit in the water reorganized on the sand and pushed inland. Units that landed in the wrong sector, and many did attach themselves to whoever was nearest and went forward with strangers. Tank crews separated from their assigned infantry worked with whatever rifle squad they found. Companies advanced in ragged, uneven clusters rather than clean lines. From a Japanese observation post on the high ground, that would have looked like disorder. In the tactical doctrine those officers had been trained in, an attacking force that cannot hold its formation is a force that cannot concentrate, and a force that cannot concentrate can be defeated in detail. But the Americans were not failing to concentrate. They were doing something the Japanese framework had no word for. They were spreading the decision. And I want to be honest about what that looked like from the inside, because it was not heroic and it did not feel like a doctrine. Felt like being 20 years old and lying behind a burning vehicle and realizing that nobody was going to tell you what to do next. That is the moment. Not courage. Just the terrible arithmetic of a young man understanding that the decision has fallen to him and that if he waits for orders, he will die waiting. And here is the thing that ties it back to part one. He could make that decision because someone had told him the objective. Because there had been a briefing and a map and a sergeant who had explained where the company was going and why. Because the American system had made a bet years earlier at a desk in Washington that an ordinary man's judgment was worth training and worth trusting. The bet was now being cashed on a beach. Now, 22 days later, on the northern end of that island, that bet was going to be tested to the absolute edge of its breaking point. By the beginning of July, Southern Command was finished as a military organization. His men had been pushed the length of the island. His artillery was largely gone. His supply had collapsed. Men were eating what they could find. His wounded had no medical support worth the name. He was in a cave near the northern tip, sick, wounded, without communications to most of his surviving units. And he made the decision that Japanese commanders had been trained their whole careers to make. He ordered a final attack. Every man who could stand. The exact date of Sakato's own death is given differently in different accounts. Most sources place it on the 6th of July, some on the 7th, and I am not going to pretend to certainty the record does not support. What is not final words to his command? He drank sake. He performed seppuku, and an adjutant shot him to finish it. And before dawn on the 7th of July, 1,944, the wave came. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men. That range is honest. Nobody counted them going in. They were not most of them an army anymore. There were soldiers with rifles. There were wounded men who had left aid stations to join. There were men carrying bayonets lashed to poles and men with nothing at all. They came down the coastal flat in the dark toward the lines of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, United States Army, part of the 27th Infantry Division. And here is what gets left out of almost every telling of this battle because it does not flatter anyone. The charge worked, not partially. It broke through. The American line there was thin and it had a gap in it, a gap that had been identified, that had been reported, and that had not been closed. The 105th's forward positions were overrun in minutes. The wave went through the perimeter and kept going, for the better part of a mile into ground where the fighting units were not. 2 American rifle battalions were effectively destroyed as fighting organizations that morning. I am not going to soften that. Something on the order of 400 Americans were killed in those positions and the surrounding action, and hundreds more wounded. Men who were there described the sound of it for the rest of their lives. If the mythology of this war tells you that Japanese banzai charges were futile gestures that broke uselessly against American firepower, the morning of the 7th of July on Saipan is the correction. In its immediate tactical purpose, that attack succeeded. It went through, and then it ran into what was behind the line. Which brings us to the 2 names I want you to remember out of this entire episode. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien was 45 years old. He was a National Guard officer from upstate New York, Troy, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 105th Infantry. A citizen soldier from a citizen regiment, in the middle of a career that had never been supposed to end like this. When the wave hit his battalion, he did not go to the rear to establish a command post. He moved along his own line in the dark on foot, under fire, pulling men into position. When his own weapons were empty, he took a pistol in each hand and kept firing. When that was gone, he climbed onto a jeep and took hold of a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on it and fired into the mass coming toward him. He was wounded, and he refused evacuation. And he stayed with his men, and he died there. His body was found afterwards, surrounded by Japanese dead. Sergeant Thomas A. Baker was 28 from Troy as well, the same city, the same regiment. Earlier in the battle, he had gone forward alone with a bazooka against a fortified position that was holding up his company and destroyed it. On the morning of the 7th, Baker was badly wounded and could not walk. A comrade carried him back as the line gave way. That man was then hit himself. Another soldier picked Baker up and kept moving, and Baker told him to stop. He asked to be left. He said he would not have them die carrying him. They propped him against a telephone pole. He asked for a pistol. He had 8 rounds in it. That is the last thing anyone alive saw. When American forces retook that ground, they found him where he had been left, still against the pole. There were 8 Japanese dead in front of him. Both men were awarded the Medal of Honor. Both posthumously. You can read the citations. They are in the public record, and they are written in the flat official language that somehow makes it worse. Now, why does the line hold in a situation like that? Because behind those 2 battalions, the system did what it had been built to do without anyone orchestrating it. Artillerymen of the 10th Marines, a Marine artillery regiment positioned to the rear, found the wave coming at them directly. There was no time for a fire mission through a fire direction center. They cranked their howitzer tubes and fired point blank into the mass in front of them, at ranges where a howitzer is no longer artillery but a very large shotgun. Nobody ordered that from a headquarters. There was no headquarters in a position to order it. The men at the guns looked at what was coming and made the decision at the gun. The men who were overrun were not riflemen. They were cooks, clerks, drivers, signalmen. Men whose specialty had been assigned to them years earlier by a test. They formed into groups of 4 and 6 and 8 and fought where they stood. That is the thing I want you to hold on to, not the heroism, the structure. The Japanese attack was designed on the assumption that if you punch through the line, what lies behind the line is soft, that the fighting strength of an enemy is concentrated at the point of contact, and that once you are past it, you are in open ground. That assumption was correct about almost every army in history. It was correct about their own. It was wrong about this one. Because the American who had been sorted by an aptitude test into a mess hall or a motor pool had still gone through basic infantry training. He still had a rifle. He had been told what the perimeter was and why it mattered. And when the line broke over him at 4 in the morning, he did not need a lieutenant to tell him that the ground he was standing on was the ground. By noon, it was afterward at more than 4,000 Japanese across that coastal plain. The battle for Saipan was in practical terms finished. And what followed was worse than the battle. In the days after the charge on the cliffs at the northern end of the island, Japanese civilians, the sugar workers and shopkeepers and farmers and their families began to kill themselves. Whole families, mothers with children in their arms. They went off the rocks at what Americans afterward called Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. They did it because they had been told, and then insistently in those final days, that the Americans would torture them, that surrender was annihilation and dishonor, that there was nothing on the other side of capture but horror. American Marines and soldiers stood below with interpreters and Japanese to come down. Some did. Most did not. I am telling you this because you cannot understand the interrogation rooms without it. The same doctrine that told a Japanese soldier not to live to suffer the shame of capture had been pushed outward into the civilian population of a Japanese island. It was not a military code by then. It was a worldview. And it had reached the point where a mother on a cliff believed the water below was safer for her child than an American with a loudspeaker. That is the system on the other side of the table at Ofuna, not a cruelty, a totality. Saipan fell in July of 1944. In Tokyo, the government of Tojo Hideki, the same man who as Minister of War had issued the Senjin-kun in January of 1941, collapsed within days. He resigned as Prime Minister on the 18th of July. The home islands were now inside bomber range. Everyone in Japanese leadership who could read a map understood it. And 600 miles closer to Tokyo, on an 8-square-mile pile of volcanic ash called Iwo Jima, a new commander was arriving with the Saipan reports in hand. He was the one man in the Japanese army who had seen this coming 20 years earlier. There is a photograph of him that survives. A small man in uniform. Round face, glasses, the look of a schoolmaster more than a soldier. Nothing in the face suggests the thing he was about to build. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi Tadamichi was 53 years old in the summer of 1944. Cavalry officer by training. Career man, graduate of the Army War College. A husband, a father, a writer of long and careful letters home, and in the 1920s the Imperial Japanese Army had sent him to the United States. And this is the detail that should stay with you longest because of what it implies about how wars actually get decided. He arrived as a deputy military attaché. He spent roughly 2 years in America. He went to Washington, and then he did something that almost no foreign officer bothered to do. He got in a car and drove. He crossed the country. He went out through the middle of the part that no attaché needs to see. The part that has no capitals and no ministries and no generals in it. He saw the plains states, he saw the automobile plants, he saw towns with a filling station and a hardware store and a grain elevator and a high school. He was not looking at the American army. In the 1920s, there was barely an American army to look at. And what he wrote home about was not divisions or fleets. It was cars. It was the sheer, ordinary, everyday density of machines in American life. Not military machines, family machines, farm machines. He was struck by how many Americans owned an automobile, and this is the part that mattered, how many of them could take one apart. He came home with a conclusion, and he did not keep it to himself. He wrote it in letters. In substance, it was this: the United States is the last country on earth Japan should ever fight. He was not saying the Americans were braver. He was not saying they were better soldiers. In the 1920s, that would have been absurd. He was saying something colder. He was saying that a country where an ordinary young man grows up fixing his own engine is a country that can convert itself into a war machine faster than Japan can destroy the product. And nobody listened. Understand what that means. In the summer of 1944, the Japanese Empire handed the defense of the doorstep to Tokyo to the one senior general who had spent 20 years telling everyone the war was unwinnable. He accepted the assignment. Of course he did. He wrote to his wife. He wrote to his children extraordinary letters, worried about drafts in the house, about his daughter's schooling, about a kitchen floor that needed fixing. A man arranging small domestic things from inside a volcano. He knew he was not coming back. He said so in plain language without theatrics. And then he set about building the most intelligently designed defensive position of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima is 8 square miles of volcanic ash and sulfur. There is no fresh water on it worth the name. At the southern end, there is a dead volcano, Mount Suribachi, 546 feet high. The rest of the island rises northward into broken ground ravines and stone. The ash is not sand. This matters. A man's boot sinks into it. A vehicle's tracks spin in it. You cannot dig a foxhole in it because the sides collapse the moment you finish. Kuribayashi looked at that and saw the answer. He would not defend the beach. Every Japanese commander before him had fought at the waterline. That was Doctrine meet the enemy, where he is most vulnerable, drive him back into the sea. Saito had tried it on Saipan, and it had worked for about an hour, and then it had not. Kuribayashi threw the Doctrine out, and he had to fight his own Navy officers on the island to do it because they wanted to fight at the water's edge, and he refused. He would let them land. He would let them come ashore, get organized, walk forward, and then he would kill them from inside the ground. What he built underneath that island, in 8 months, with hand tools and inadequate labor, in tunnels where the sulfur fumes were so bad that men could only work 10 minutes at a stretch before being pulled out to breathe, was difficult to hold in the mind. The plan called for something on the order of 28 kilometers of tunnel. What was actually finished by February of 1945 was less. Construction was still going on when the Americans arrived, and the honest figure is somewhere in the range of 11 to 18 kilometers, depending on which survey you trust. Anyone who gives you one confident number is guessing. But the scale is not the point. The design is the point. Positions were connected underground. A gun crew could fire from an aperture, withdraw through a tunnel, and reappear 200 yards away and fire again, so that an American squad that carefully suppressed a bunker would find themselves being shot at from the position they had just cleared. Firing slits were cut low and narrow, sometimes barely wider than a rifle, not for the view, so that nothing could be thrown or fired into them. Positions were sighted to cover each other. Attack one and two others engage you from ground you cannot see. Shafts were angled to disperse flame. Blast walls were built to absorb concussion. Chambers were carved out for headquarters, for hospitals, for ammunition. And here is what makes this the most interesting piece of engineering in the entire Pacific War. It was not designed to stop an army. It was designed to stop a specific American capability, the one that had killed Saito's plan on Saipan. He left no document saying so in those terms. This is what the design itself tells us. Kuribayashi had seen those reports. He knew what happened when the American plan broke and the Americans kept moving. He knew about the sergeant who takes over, the corporal who finds the gap, the group of men who look at a problem in front of them and solve it without waiting for an order. So he built a battlefield where there was no problem to look at. And that is what separates Iwo Jima from every other island in this war. You cannot outthink a gun that is cannot locate. American small unit initiative depended on a man being able to see the situation and act. Kuribayashi put the situation underground where seeing it was impossible. He aimed at the seam. He aimed at the exact thing this entire story has been about, the distributed judgment of the American enlisted man, and he built 8 square miles of volcanic rock specifically to make it irrelevant. On the 19th of February, 1945, at around 9 in the morning, first waves of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions came ashore on the southeastern beaches. That is the detail that survivors never forgot. The silence. They came out of the boats expecting Tarawa. expecting the wall of fire that had met the men on Saipan, and there was nothing. Some of them walked up that black slope thinking the bombardment had done its work. Some of them said later that they thought it was going to be easy. They kept coming, wave after wave. Men, then vehicles, then more men, until the beach behind them was packed. Kuribayashi waited about an hour and then he opened. Everything at once. Artillery pre-registered on that sand. Mortars, including enormous 320mm spigot mortars that threw a projectile the men called a flying ash can, which came down slowly enough to see and destroyed everything within its radius. Machine guns from Kuribayashi at their backs and from the high ground in front of them, and the ash would not let them dig. Every instinct a man under fire has is to get into the ground, and the ground refused. They scraped and the sides ran back in like water. The first day on that island cost the Marines around 2,000 casualties. The battle was planned for a few days. It ran 36. On the 23rd of February, the 5th day, a patrol took the summit of Kuribayashi and raised a flag. A second larger flag went up shortly after. And Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press photographed it. And that image became perhaps the most reproduced photograph in American history. Here is the part people forget. The photograph was taken out of a 36-day battle. Roughly 3/4 of all the American casualties on Iwo Jima happened after that flag went up. The picture that Americans understood as victory was, for the men on the island, the beginning. Because the fight then turned north into ground the Marines named for what it did to them. The quarry, Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, and a stretch of broken rock that they called the meat grinder. And this is where I have to be careful, because this is exactly the point where this story could turn into a comfortable myth. The comfortable version says the American private outsmarted the fortress, that some young man from Ohio invented a clever trick and the tunnels fell. That is not what happened. I am not going to tell you that. What happened on Iwo Jima was closer to industrial demolition than to cleverness, and it was carried out at a cost that ought to make anyone quiet. They did it with flamethrowers and demolition charges. They did it by working forward in small teams, a few riflemen to suppress the aperture, a demolition man to get a satchel charge against the position, a finish it one hole at a time, then the next hole, then the next. They did it with Sherman tanks fitted with flame projectors, which turned out to be the single most effective weapon on the island, because a flame tank could put burning fuel into a cave mouth from a distance and survive being shot at while doing it. And they did it in a sequence that had to be repeated thousands of times, because after every cleared position there was another one, connected underground, occupied again by men who had walked there in the dark. Where the small unit initiative actually showed, and it did show, it is all through the record, was not in inventing miracle tactics. It was in the reorganizing. Squads that lost their leaders reformed and kept going. Tank crews separated from their assigned infantry attached themselves to whatever unit was in front of them. Engineers fought as riflemen. Men from different companies, sometimes different divisions, ended up in the same rock cluster and worked out among themselves who was doing what. That is not glamorous. It is the least cinematic entire story. It is also the thing Kuribayashi could not stop. He had built a fortress that defeated the American plan. He had not built one that could defeat an army where the plan's death was survivable, where the failure of the timetable did not produce paralysis, because the men on the ground did not require the timetable in order to continue. They advanced 100 yards a day, sometimes 50, sometimes nothing, and they kept coming. Kuribayashi held out longer than anyone in Tokyo expected. His final messages went out in March. He apologized for not having done better with the resources he had been. He was killed in the last days, most probably in a final attack he led personally toward the southern end of the island, near where the invasion had begun 5 weeks earlier. His body was never identified. He is somewhere in that ground still. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed on Iwo Jima. 19,000 wounded. Of the garrison of roughly 21,000 Japanese, all but a little over 200 died. Some held out in the tunnels for weeks after the island was declared secure. A very small number came out years later. 27 medals of honor were awarded for that island, more than for any other single action in American history. Kuribayashi had been right in the late 1920s, and he was right in 1945. He had told them not to fight this country. Then he had spent his last months proving, in the most terrible way available, exactly how expensive being right can be. And now I want to bring you back to a room, because the war does not end on Iwo Jima. And the last thing I have to tell you happens at a table with a chair and a man being asked questions. Osaka, the 8th of August, 1945. 2 days earlier, a single aircraft had dropped a single weapon on Hiroshima, and a city had ceased to function. Japan did not know what had hit it. In the first days after Hiroshima, Japanese leadership had reports of a catastrophe and no reliable explanation for it. Scientists were being sent to look. The government was arguing about whether the American claims were even possible, or whether this was a very large conventional raid dressed up as something else. They needed to know. How many are there? Where next? Into that vacuum on the 8th of August fell a 24-year-old lieutenant named Marcus McDilda. He was a P-51 pilot flying from Iwo Jima, the same island, taken at that cost, now serving exactly the purpose it had been taken for. Accounts differ on how he came down. Some say enemy fire, some say his engine seized. What is not in dispute is that his aircraft went into the water off the coast near Osaka. He was pulled out and taken, and then he was walked through the streets of that city, blindfolded and bound, while civilians beat him. Understand what those civilians had lived through. Osaka had been burned by incendiary raids. They knew what came out of American aircraft. He was handed to the Kempitai, the Army's military police, and taken to an interrogation room, and they asked him about the bomb. He did not know anything. That is the entire point of what follows. He was a fighter pilot who flew a single-engine aircraft and shot at things on the ground. He had never heard of the Manhattan Project. He did not know what had happened at Hiroshima beyond what his captors were telling him. He said so. He told them the truth. They did not believe him, so they beat him, and they questioned him. And they beat him again. And at some point an officer drew a sword and made it clear what the next answer was going to cost him. And Marcus McDilda, 24 years old, in a room in Osaka with a blade in front of him, made a decision. He told them the United States had 100 atomic bombs. He told them Tokyo and Kyoto were next within days. He picked those two cities for one reason. They were the only Japanese cities whose names he could remember. And here is the thing that closes this entire story like a lock. They believed him. The man who had told the truth had been beaten. The man who invented a number out of terror was treated as a source of the highest importance. He was moved immediately toward Tokyo, and what he had said traveled faster than he did. It reached the top. War Minister Anami Korechika, the man leading the faction inside the Japanese government that wanted to keep fighting, told the cabinet that a captured American pilot had admitted under interrogation that the United States possessed a stockpile of 100 bombs, and that Tokyo and Kyoto would be destroyed within days. That was a lie told by a terrified 24-year-old to keep from being killed in a basement, and it was sitting in front of the government of Japan as intelligence. The truth about it did not take long. In Tokyo, McDilda was put in a room with a civilian scientist. Tea was poured. The man introduced himself pleasantly and mentioned that he was a graduate of City College of New York. Then he began asking questions about nuclear physics. Within a few minutes, he knew. McDilda could not answer anything. The story fell apart under the first competent examination it had ever received. The scientist asked him why he had lied, and McDilda told him the truth, which was that he had tried telling the truth and it had not worked. He survived. He was held at Omori, the camp on the artificial island in Tokyo Bay, and he was there when American forces arrived after the surrender. He went home to Florida. He lived until 1998. Now let me tell you what that story does and does not mean, because this is where I have to be most careful with you. It does not mean McDilda's lie ended the war. Some accounts have suggested it swayed the Japanese decision. There is no solid basis for that claim, and I am not going to hand it to you. On the 9th of August, while McDilda was still being moved, two things happened that were rather larger than one prisoner's confession. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan on the 8th, and in the early hours of the 9th, its armies crossed into Manchuria. And a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki in the middle of a meeting of the Supreme War Council. Those are the events that broke the argument in Tokyo. What the McDilda episode does prove is smaller and much sharper. It proves that the machinery did not work. Here is a system that had spent the entire war extracting information from prisoners by force. At Ofuna, with the 2-week cycle and the cross-check notebooks. In Kempeitai rooms across the empire, thousands of hours, thousands of men, an enormous investment of institutional effort. And in the single most important intelligence question the Japanese empire ever faced, how many of these weapons does the enemy have, that machinery produced a number invented on the spot by a man who knew nothing and delivered it to the war minister as fact. That is not a moral failure. It is an engineering failure. It produces the answer that stops the pain. And a system that cannot tell those two things apart will eventually be steered by the imagination of frightened men. The empire had built an instrument that could not distinguish a fact from a scream. In the autumn of 1945, American officers sat down in Tokyo with Japanese admirals and generals for the interviews that became the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. They asked about production, shipping, air defense, decisions. You can read those transcripts. They are public. They are also in places a document of men slowly finding words for something they had spent 4 years unable to say. And at Yokohama, years the staff of Ofuna and other camps stood trial, the guards, the interrogators. The men from the hallway with the 30 rooms on each side. The names of the prisoners, finally, were written down. So let me answer the question this whole story started with, and let me answer it honestly rather than comfortably. Why did captured Americans stun Japanese officers during interrogation? Not because they were braver. Many of them talked, and there is no shame in that, and any man who tells you he would have held out has never been hungry in the dark. Not because they knew more, though the systems that produced them were built on opposite principles about who deserves to know things. They stunned those officers because they sat down across the table behaving like men who still had a future. They asked about mail. They asked about the Red Cross. They referred to a convention, to a mechanism, to a system that had written their names down somewhere and would eventually come and get them. And the officer across the table knew there was no mail, knew the name was written nowhere, knew the camp had been built precisely so that no such mechanism could reach inside it. He came from a country that had told its own soldiers not to live to suffer the shame of capture, and then had not bothered to write a procedure for what to do if it happened anyway, because officially it could not happen. He was looking at a man his own institution had declared impossible. That is the collision, and I want to be honest with you about what kind of claim that is. It is a reading of the evidence, not a transcript. No Japanese officer wrote it down in those words. What we have is the pattern the prisoners described, and what we know about the two systems that built these men. But the pattern holds. Not courage against cruelty. Two societies that had each made a bet about the worth of an ordinary man, meeting in a concrete room unable to recognize each other. One had spent 9 million tests and 4 years of federal money deciding that the mind of a farm kid was worth measuring. The other had spent 70 years and a great deal of institutional violence making certain that the mind of a farm kid never entered the calculation at all. And here is the thing I want to leave you with, and it is not a triumphant thing. Kuribayashi understood it. 20 years early. From behind the wheel of a car, somewhere in the middle of America, watching young men who could fix their own engines. He went home and told them, and they did not listen. And 16 years later, he built the most brilliant defensive position of the war against exactly the thing he had warned them about. And he died in a hole in the ground on an island that cost 7,000 American lives to take. There is no cleverness in this story that saved anybody. There is only cost. Marcus McDilda flew off Iwo Jima. Men died taking that island so that he could. He lied to survive, and his lie went to the cabinet of Japan, and the war ended for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Thomas Baker asked to be set against a telephone pole with 8 rounds. William O'Brien, 45 years old, from Troy, New York, died on a jeep with his hands on a machine gun. They were not exceptional men when they were tested at a reception center in 1940 and 1941. They were ordinary Americans who had been given information, given training, and given the thing that turned out to matter most, the assumption that their judgment was worth something. That assumption was the weapon, not the rifle, not the carrier. The decision made at a desk in Washington by a 59-year-old psychologist most Americans have never heard of, that an ordinary man's mind was an asset worth measuring. Japan never found an answer to it, not because they lacked courage, they had more of that than any nation should have to spend. Not because they lacked intelligence, they had a great deal. Because they could not bring themselves to believe that the lowest-ranking man in the room might be the one who decided the war. Thank you for watching, truly. If someone in your family carried this, a father, an uncle, a brother, a man who came home and did not talk about it, I would be glad to hear his name in the comments. Where he served, what he did afterward. These men were ordinary, that was the whole point, and ordinary is what deserves remembering.